Now, South Korea's exports grew at the slowest pace in nearly 2 years in September and recorded 6 straight months of trade deficit. Now, this is more bad news as the country sees its currency continue to plummet against the dollar, while borrowing costs and the cost of living are surging, with the US Federal Reserve set to continue hiking its benchmark interest rates. So where is the South Korean economy headed, and is the government taking a sufficient response to prevent further fallout? We discuss these questions today with YANG Hee-dong, Professor of Business Administration at Ewha Women's University, and Danny M. Leipziger, Professor of International Business at George Washington University. Very warm welcome to you both. And well, to get started, let's go to you first, Professor Yang, joining us from Seoul. We saw South Korea's export growth slowing significantly in September, and we marked a $3.77 billion deficit, and that's a 6th consecutive month in the red. Do you see this downward trajectory continuing?
Well, in September, our trade deficit amounted to almost $3.8 billion. Due to a very low increase in the export, we had a 2.8% increase YOY, which is the lowest level in the last 47 months. Whereas we had 18.6% increase of the import YOY due to the price increase of 3 major energies such as oil, LNG, and coal. Well, 6-month consecutive trade deficit is a new record in the last 25 years since 1997. And what's worse is FKI estimated that the annual trade deficit will amount to $48 billion, which is about 2.3 times bigger than that in 1996, a year before we had the IMF foreign currency crisis. So what are the major reasons for this poor record? The first one is everyone knows that there is the energy price increase due to Russian-Ukraine war, etc. So that means we need to reserve and secure very stable supply chains, and also we need to take care of the exchange rate. And second major reason for this poor performance is the Korean government has taken a very favorable side towards the United States. You know, here are 2 major export countries from our side, the United States and China. So this year, I mean, in the last 30 years after 1992, we come to have the first trade deficit with China, $1 billion in May this year. And so far, after May, our trade deficit against China amount to $3.3 billion. So these are 2 major reasons for the poor performance of our trade balance. And if you ask me whether this trend will continue for a while, I should say yes, because if you take a look at the exchange rate or interest rate, we'll get back later on, and also the government's choice in favor of the United States will continue for a while. So that is my conclusion.
I see. And Professor Leipziger, now South Korea and the United States over the weekend, the 2 countries agreed to implement liquidity facilities to improve financial stability if needed after the country's finance chiefs held a teleconference. So what kind of measures or mechanisms would this involve?
Well, I think what's happened is that the U.S. Treasury and the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank have reinstituted a swap agreement whereby the Central Bank can use up to $60 billion in funds. I mean, Korea and the U.S. have had swap agreements before in 2008 and again in 2020. So Secretary Yellen and your Minister of Finance have agreed to this swap agreement. Basically, I think one should look at the exchange rate volatility and the decline in the value of the won in the following way. First is that major currencies in East Asia have all declined versus the dollar. The yen has lost 20%, the renminbi 10%, the won roughly 15% since the beginning of the year. And this is mostly due to the fact that the Fed has started increasing interest rates in a pretty aggressive way to fight inflation. And this means that capital will flow out and exchange rates will depreciate. Normally, you would expect depreciating exchange rate to help your exports. But as Professor Han has just said, exports are not doing particularly well. And that's because the global economy is in the doldrums, and probably many countries are headed towards recession. China has got a growth rate which is half of what it was before. And the US and Europe are not doing well. So I think it's harder for Korea to take advantage of this depreciating won, while on the same side, they have to pay for imports, which are more costly. So I think what will happen is that the central bank will have to decide, now the won is at 14.25, do they want to try to intervene and create a little bit more stability in the market? Japan recently did this, but Japan is an odd situation because they're also pursuing expansionary monetary policy. So in the case of Korea, the discount rates are starting to come up, and government through the central bank is trying to deal with inflation. But it's a difficult time, I think, for policy.
Right, tough times for many monetary policymakers all over the world, really. And well, Professor Yang, the Korean won, though, it declined to its lowest level in 13 years late last month, and it's actually one of the world's worst performing currencies. I mean, what's made it so vulnerable?
Well, this problem is pretty serious. If you take a look at the history of the Korean won and dollar exchange rate, the changes. This is the third time when the currency exchange rate is over 1,401. In the 1997 and 8, when we had the IMF crisis, and the year 2008 and 9, when we had the financial crisis. Those were two times when our exchange rate exceeded 1,401. Well, as Prof. Leipziger mentioned, Korean currency has been deteriorated about 15% compared to early this year. As Japan's yen and the euros and the pounds were deteriorated over the 20%. So someone says that our, the exchange rate is not that bad as those other currencies. But the problem is, if you take a look at the $1 swap rate for 3 months, it is about minus 143%. That means in the next 3 months, in the market, lots of people estimate that the Korean currency will be deteriorated around 43%, which is really, really bad. So major victims from this deteriorated exchange rate are, the airline companies that depend on the overseas rentals, and it's the industry that imports the major materials from the overseas, and medium-sized companies that produce their manufactured finished products from the import materials. So lots of companies, that plan for the overseas investment, such as the LG Energy Solutions. What's the major reason for this abruptly deteriorated Korean exchange rate? The first major reason is the Federal Reserve Bank has increased their base rate for the 3 times in a row by taking the giant steps and 75 BPs. So now their base rate is about 3 to 3.25%. The problem is for the next couple of months, they will make other steps, increasing by 1.25. So their base rate will increase to 4.5%. Well, they will continue to increase their base rate because they declare that their target, the inflation rate, is about 2%. So yeah, they will continue this effort, and I'm afraid that our exchange rate will be deteriorated furthermore.
I see. And Professor Leipziger, well, how does a widespread liquidity crunch affect the South Korean economy?
Well, I think the answer to your question is it affects households, and it affects the corporate sector the most. Of course, government will have to pay more for government debt, but government debt is not the major part. If you look at Korea's situation compared to other OECD countries, its debt to GDP ratio is very high. Different from Japan, more than 100% of the debt to GDP is household debt. The housing market and the way mortgages are structured means that consumers will have greater difficulty in managing their mortgages as interest rates rise. And that's, a feature of the Korean housing market. On top of that, corporate debt is another 115% of GDP. So there are companies that are reasonably highly leveraged. that have to repay and roll over their debt. So the liquidity issue may at some point become more acute. At the moment, the interest rates in Korea are still reasonable compared to the rest of the world. But that means that the central bank is in this tough situation because on the one hand, they want to be tough on inflation. They need to respond to what the Fed is doing and not have interest rates that are demonstrably lower. But in raising interest rates, they also cause greater problems, both for household debt as well as corporate debt. So that's why it's a tough situation. I think the governor of the central bank is between a rock and a hard place because he's got very few instruments and he's got a lot of difficulties that he has to manage.
Exactly, and I believe the Bank of Korea governor said that the Bank of Korea might be independent from the South Korean government, but it's not independent from the US Fed. And well, on that note, Professor Yang, as the US Fed looks to continue hiking its base rates, how will tightening measures by the BOK really affect businesses and the cost of living in South Korea? I mean, on that note, do you think the government is doing enough to really protect our livelihoods?
Well, everyone knows that there is a vicious cycle over this increased exchange rate because if the exchange rate is high, then our import price will go up, and the consumer price index will go up, and the BOK will increase the base rate, and our economy will be in depression. So we need to control over this vicious cycle. And so what kind of measures do we have? The first one is the current bank, BOK, will also need to increase the interest rate to match up to balance with the interest rate in the United States. Secondly, we need to control over the price increases. We need to distinguish between nominal exchange rate and effective exchange rate. Even though our nominal exchange rate was deteriorated by 15%, but our effective exchange rate, considering the price increase, is about not that bad, 3.9%. Japan has about 13.9%, or 4% deterioration for the effective exchange rate. So we need to control very tightly over price increase. And third, we need to occupy and reserve and secure more dollars. We have enough foreign exchange reserve up to $440 billion. And the foreign currency, the liquidity coverage rate is not that bad, 50% higher than the government recommendation. And FTSI put the Korea at level number 2 in the World Global Bond Index. That may attract about $5 or $6 billion more into the bond investment. But our government need to increase their communication with the United States. As the Chu Kyung-ho and Janet Yellen just mentioned about the liquidity facilities, and our President Yoon and the Biden is mentioned about the materializing the cooperation for the liquidity. All these communications and exposing this kind of intensive collaboration make a very positive impact on the future estimation about exchange rate.
Well, it certainly sounds like there's a lot of communication, as you said, is needed. And Professor Leipziger, now what further shocks do you think South Korean households and businesses should really prepare themselves for?
Well, I think the World Bank just issued a report last week on what the title is Global Recession Inevitable. And I don't think it's inevitable, but I think the probabilities have really increased. I think the difficulties in the U.S. are that the Fed will continue to tighten to reduce inflation, but a lot of the inflation is coming from the supply side, from fuel and fertilizers and food and transport costs, et cetera. So that's not something that central banks can control. So therefore, they may end up tightening excessively and actually creating a recession. So I think the probabilities for global recession in early 2023 are substantial. The implication for Korea is that that's really bad news for the export sector. If you think about the pieces of the economy that can drive economic growth, we're actually, in the case of Korea, exports are 35% of GDP, so that's, more than a third is going to be determined by global circumstances. Then you have investment, investment is going to not be very robust when you have rising interest rates and greater uncertainty. And then you have government spending, which the new administration is trying to curtail because they spent a lot. The government spent a lot in the stimulus packages about COVID, so they're trying to bring government spending down. So that really leaves only consumer demand. And similar to the U.S., consumer demand in Korea is still reasonably robust. But gradually, as I said, because of the costs of housing and other expenses and inflation, that may recede as well. So I think the risk for the economy in general is that growth will slow down, and that people will end up having to spend more on the basics. So 2023 looks like a very difficult year. The only silver lining is that for many countries, it's a lot worse. Korea does have, as Professor Yang said, a lot of reserves. Now with the swap agreement, you add another 60 billion, that's 500 billion. There's not a lot of external debt, so that's not the big problem. I think the bigger problem is domestic debt, as I mentioned, where interest rates have this negative effect on the economy. But I don't think the central bank has much choice. So frankly, I think the real dynamic is going to be what happens with the exchange rate. I know it's uncomfortable to have such a weak won and not get the benefits, not see exports booming because you have a weak exchange rate. But hopefully that will be a phenomenon for 2023 and things can return a bit more to normality in 2024.
I see. I suppose policymakers will really have to be very resourceful and also very slick about it too. Well, that was YANG Hee-dong, Professor of Business Administration at Ewha Women's University, and Danny M. Leipziger, Professor of International Business at George Washington University. Thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be with you.